Hello everyone. Today we're not going to do a history movie review. We're just going to talk about straight up history, and I'm joined by the, in my opinion, superb YouTuber Apostolic Majesty. AM, how are you?
I'm wonderful, thank you, and thank you very much for that introduction, Bo. I'm very happy to be here.
Yeah, no, thanks for your time. And although your channel is quite small, like mine, I think it is truly excellent and deserves, well, in a just world, you'd have hundreds of thousands or millions of subs. I really detect and nothing fraudulent in your content, no corner cuttings whatsoever. You seem like you know, a real scholar. You know your stuff absolutely inside out, and that's you can't say that across the board about all history channels. And more than that, I'm very impressed by the way you can jump around between time periods and places in history and even literature with complete ease, it seems. Again, that's even rarer. So I'm very, very happy to have you on.
Well, thank you very much for that. Hopefully, I can live up to those expectations on this stream.
Well, today we thought we could talk about Justinian the First, because it is sort of one of the highlights, I think, of the Eastern Roman world, or of the entire Roman world. That's not an exaggeration, do you think?
No, it's not an exaggeration. He's certainly the highlight after the collapse of the Western Roman Empire proper in 476, and he represents possibly the first and really the last serious attempt to unify the entirety of the Roman world, albeit unsuccessfully. And much of his legacy will be overturned. But in fairness to him, due to a situation which was beyond his control, such as the plague of Justinian and the wars in the east as well, and also the invasion of the Langobards. But I guess if you want to start this conversation, do you want me to talk about the end of the Western Roman Empire and the early life of Justinian?
Yes, well, that's exactly what I'd like you to do. That's brilliant. One of the things I wanted to set up is probably the reign of Justin, his uncle, his immediate predecessor. But really, just if we can try and paint a picture of the 6th century, Europe and the Near East in the 6th century, because as you mentioned, the Western Roman Empire had just fallen a generation or two before. And so if people are used to sort of the Roman world as it would exist in the age of Trajan or Hadrian, say, the world is very different by that point. The Italy has fallen, and the barbarians are using Ravenna as a capital, not even Rome anymore. So yeah, if you could
Sure.
paint a bit of a picture for us, that'd be excellent.
Sure. So before we get to Justinian proper, talking about the world of the late fifth and the 6th centuries, the Western Roman Empire, of course, came to an end in 476. The last emperor was Romulus Augustulus, even though some claim that Julius Nepos was the last official Roman emperor. And a barbarian warlord known as Odovaker, one of the federati of the last sort of grey eminence of the Western Roman Empire, Orestes, had taken over and seized the capital of Ravenna. You mentioned how Ravenna was the capital then. Yes, Ravenna had been established as the capital throughout much of the 5th century, principally because the location, in the marshy lands of the eastern Romagna region, was a much more secure place to have a capital rather than Rome, which had basically been outgrown by the empire, so to speak, even by the 3rd century. So the fact that Ravenna would become the capital of this barbarian principality makes complete sense. But the interesting feature about this post Roman world in Italy is that many of the denizens of the Roman Empire claimed Roman citizenship, and they were abiding by Roman laws. So first Odovaker, and then Theodoric. Theodoric will depose Odovaker in 493. There is this continuity of Roman institutions, Roman law, and even deference to the Eastern Roman Empire. So Theodoric the Great Austro-Gothic king, who will take over Italy at the end of the 5th century and rule for quite a long time, until 30 years. Despite being a heretic by the attitudes of the Pope and the Eastern Roman Emperor, was nevertheless a great king, and he maintained Roman laws, Roman systems of governance, and you have this wonderful mausoleum dedicated to him, and this imagery, the mosaic art, which you're going to see later in Ravenna and various churches throughout Rome. In terms of the west of the world at that time, of course, in Spain you had the Visigothic kingdom, which had been established by the descendants of Alaric, the first warlord to sack Rome. In France, you had the domain of Soissons, which had been, a rump state of the Roman Empire, first led by Aegidius and then Sagagius, who was, deposed by Clovis and would form the Frankish Empire. The Frankish Empire, which would eventually, unify most of the Western Roman Empire and form the Carolingian Empire under Charlemagne. In the East, of course, we had the Sasanian Empire, which were the continuation to some extent of the legacy of the Achaemenid Empire, which had, briefly sort of taken over from the Parthians. So when we get to the Eastern Roman Empire proper, you had, a series of emperors who basically more or less lost interest in affairs of the West. These would be the emperors Zeno and the Emperor Leo before him. But in 491, we have the ascension of the Roman Emperor Anastasius, who comes in very late in his life. He's in his 60s, and he will rule for 26 years or so until, or 27 years until 518. And during this reign, we have you can say a major consolidation of the empire. I mean, unlike in the West, which had completely collapsed due to the barbarification, you can say, of most of the forces there. Many civil service appointments and war bands, etc., had taken over the functions of the military functions within the empire. And in the East, this issue had basically been resolved, and moreover, the empire was prosperous. Anastasius had successfully reduced taxes and increased income at the same time. And so by the time we have the reign of Justin, the empire is exceptionally prosperous. Justin is an interesting case because he comes from a peasant family in Dardania region in Thrace. And just to put this in perspective, Justin and of course his nephew Justinian, Justinian wasn't his original name. His original name was Petrus Sabatius, after his father Sabatius. He, you could say, almost is the last of these Latinized Roman emperors, because he comes from a region just north of the city of Adrianople, modern-day Edirne, where most of the Thracians, the Illyrians, the Dacians have been thoroughly Romanized. So
I was going to say, is that like Dacia? Is that sort of modern Bulgaria we're talking?
Yes, modern-day Bulgaria. Again, the region between Dacia and Thrace. So yes, he ironically enough was probably the last sort of culturally Roman of all the emperors, and his uncle Justin had become the comes excubitorum, and just for perspective, the excubitores had been a major sort of crack regiment of the palace guard, filled with these barbarians called the Isaurians, and Justin at the age of 66 unexpectedly becomes emperor due to the backing of one of the demes or charioteer factions in Constantinople known as the Blues. Just for perspective, the previous emperor Anastasius had been supportive of the Greens, and his nephew Justinian had been brought in, received this fantastic education despite his lowly upbringings, and in the year 421 would be named consul. And from that point on, because his uncle was very old, he would effectively become the power behind the throne.
Right, yeah. Great. I mean, you've touched on a load of things there already, so thanks for that brief tour of the Mediterranean there. So you've got sort of the Vandals in North Africa, the Visigoths in Spain, Iberia, and sort of the Ostrogoths in Italy, and the Franks in what would become France, and then the Sassanids out east. And one of the headlines from Justinian's reign is that he wanted to reconquer the entire old Roman world, which he attempts to do with varying degrees of success, which I'm sure we'll get into. And the one thing I wanted to ask you about is Justinian Anastasius. I suppose Anastasius is known for being very prudent in terms of economy. He left the empire with vast reserves of gold, I'm given to understand. But the question I want to ask you about Justin, which is Justinian's uncle, is that his father was just a shepherd or something. And he joined the army, so he was the son of a nobody, a peasant essentially. Yeah. And he joins the army, he has a prolific career and ends up sort of head of a palace guard, at which point he's able to, for various reasons, transfer that into the actual purple to become emperor himself. And so anyway, you end up with Justinian, who is known for centuries and centuries to come as sort of maybe a paragon of majesty. he's sort of an extreme example of how great a monarch can be. And yet he's the grandson of a shepherd or a swineherd or something. So the idea that perhaps in the age of, say, Caesar or Augustus, it would be impossible, very difficult, maybe impossible for somebody of no birth, really, to rise that high. I'm thinking, like the age of the Julii, everyone had to be aristocratic to some degree. Whereas here, now in the 6th century, not so much. And I find it interesting that Justinian is thought of by people in sort of the 8th, 9th, 10th century as just, a great example of monarchy, and yet he came from nothing. I find that interesting.
Absolutely, and as you mentioned, going back to that link, when the Roman Empire had been founded, it had been under the auspices of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, which claimed divine descent not only from divine Julius Caesar, who of course was deified after his assassination, but directly from Venus, who was the progenitor of Aeneas. And then you have a huge amount of Roman mythology dedicated around the imperial cult to try and substantiate that. No, by you can really say this idea of, the supreme sort of the exemplars of Roman patrician society ruling over as emperors had been done away with the deposition of Nero. And as you say, by this time we have essentially anyone who is in a powerful military position at that time could be thrust into the position of emperor. So, I mean, yes, this happens repeatedly, especially in the Eastern Empire. So, for example, the founder of the greatest of all the Byzantine imperial dynasties, the Macedonian dynasty, Basil, he was essentially a Armenian peasant and a stable member, and was known for his brute physical strength. And yet he was able to form, one of the longest lasting of all the Roman dynasties. So yes, from these very uncertain, beginnings. I mean, Justinian, in contrast to that, at least he was, Latinized and spoke Latin. But the later emperors, ethnically, there's a hodgepodge all over the place. There is, you could say, this complete disconnect between the old Roman patrician classes claiming this exalted ancestry and the actual rough figures who end up becoming Roman emperors.
It's very interesting. It seems that sort of social mobility was a lot more fluid in that period.
Yes.
Which is just an interesting thought, I think. But if we move on to the career of Justin, the sort of military usurper, you might say. Maybe that's a bit harsh, but I think that's more or less fair enough. But as you mentioned, he came to the purple quite late in life. He was in his 60s, maybe mid-60s, which, it's no spring chicken for those days. And it seems that though he was very good at his job of raising through the ranks of the army, he wasn't necessarily cut out for the top job. I've got a very, very quick 3-line quote here from Edward Gibbon, who says of him, this is Justin, Justinian's uncle, his immediate predecessor. He says of Justin, the experience of a soldier had not qualified him for the government of an empire, and though personally brave, the consciousness of his own weakness was naturally attended with doubt, distrust, and political apprehension. So I think that says quite a lot. Although he was able to get himself into that top position, which is no small feat, he just didn't have quite the set of personal characteristics needed to hold on to it. And it seems that his nephews, of which Justinian was only one, correct me on this if I'm wrong, were able to essentially usurp his position.
Yes, I question it really being a usurpation, because you mentioned the usurpation of Justin. Well, the idea of primogeniture or dynastic succession never, in the entire history of the Roman Empire and the Byzantine Empire, is an established principle, unlike the notion of monarchy we know today. So Anastasius had 3 nephews, and he was torn over the idea of the succession throughout his entire life. And there's this myth regarding the ascent of Justin, where he had placed a little slip with the word regnum, of course meaning kingdom, underneath 3 sofas, and invited all of his nephews, to a guest party, and they would each assume sit on one of these sofas, and the nephew who took the title would become emperor. But of course, the story also goes that two of these nephews enjoyed each other a little too much, and so one of the sofas was vacated, and that happened to be the sofa with the slip with the name Regnum.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.